Hello and welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the Brisbane Dialogues second event, with tonight's topic on everyone's mind. Could universal basic income work here in Australia? My name is Kayci Gillies and I am a First Nations, Gubbi Gubbi and Kamilaroi woman, and I'm very fortunate to be your MC tonight. I support the Brisbane Dialogues because I believe effective communication is the only way to progress. My partner and I have practiced the Brisbane Rule at home and with great results. Now, I would like to take this moment to let everyone know to put their phones on silent, and the exits are to the back and to the side, and the bar to the sides as well. The Brisbane Dialogues was formed late last year by a few friends who were alarmed by growing polarisation and toxic discourse, and decided to do something about it. And as we can witness on our screens each night, it is still a big problem. Well, the Brisbane Dialogues has at least a small part of the solution. It's about setting an example ourselves and helping other organisations to turn one-way or one-sided talks into good discussions between people of different views, getting the tribes together and talking, as we like to think about it. Not just having civil discussions, but collaborative, productive, even if difficult ones. The Brisbane Dialogues is a wholly independent, non-aligned, not-for-profit, all-volunteer organisation. And that's the way we like to keep it for as long as we can. It's surprising what a small group of accidental amateur event organisers can do. As a very late addition to the team, I want to personally thank all the volunteers in the content, marketing and event management groups who have worked very hard over the last few months to make tonight happen. On behalf of the team, I want to extend our warmest gratitude to all the partner organisations who have helped spread the word about this event, and also especially to the Tivoli owners, Dave and Steve Sleswick, who have donated the use of this amazing venue and all the services that come with it. Their generosity, patience, and practical support has been huge. Especially at such a hard time in the music industry. Now, I would like to acknowledge the Turrbal and Yagara peoples, the First Nations traditional owners of Meanjin, which is also known as the Greater Brisbane region. I pay my respects to the ancestors of the past, the elders of now, the educators and the emerging leaders who continue to keep the world's oldest surviving culture alive today. As our first MC, Christine Jackman, suggested in March, the Brisbane Dialogues is in a way picking up on a tradition of collaboration and dialogue that has been conducted on these lands for tens of thousands of years. Dialogue is fundamental to Indigenous culture, and many elements ring true today. For example, gathering in a congenial place, listening carefully, walking together when conversations start to get difficult, recognising that some speakers have greater specialist knowledge or are better at dialogue, accepting that agreement is not always possible, and seeking a conclusion that makes everyone as happy as possible. I think you will agree there is a lot in this to reflect on, learn from and adapt in modern society. But coming to tonight's discussion, all we ask is that everybody respects a simple rule announced at the launch. The Brisbane Rule. The slightly edited second version goes: all participants agree to listen carefully, speak respectfully, and concentrate on the content of discussions, not on characters, before, during, and afterwards, online as well as offline. This might be easier said than done for many of us, but we can all try harder and get better at it. It is now my pleasure to introduce the speakers and to hand over to the moderator for tonight's discussion. Our first speaker is the sole survivor of the original list of 3 interstate speakers, Gigi Foster. She is Professor in the School of Economics at the University of New South Wales and presenter of the Economists broadcast on ABC Radio National. Welcome, Gigi. Next we have Greg Marston, Deputy Executive Dean of the Faculty of Humanities and Social Sciences at University of Queensland and representative in Australia for Basic Income Earth Network, the umbrella organisation for the global universal basic income movement. Welcome, Greg. Our third speaker is John Humphreys, lecturer in economics at the Universities of Queensland, the Sunshine Coast, and a fellow of the Australian Institute for Progress, a Brisbane think tank. Welcome, John. And our fourth speaker, Simon Cowan, Research Director for the Centre of Independent Studies, has been grounded in Sydney, but he will be beamed in by video message shortly. Finally, our moderator, Bob MacDonald, long-standing business journalist, currently a contributor to the New Daily Online Journal in Queensland, and a former ministerial advisor to state Labor governments, and Australian Trade Commissioner to Mexico and Chile. Welcome, Bob, and over to you.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Kayci. It's really great so many people show up tonight, and I think the timing was almost accidental because when I know Murray was talking about this, the world seemed a sensible place, and things like universal basic incomes were a nice theoretical debate, but clearly at the moment the demand for finding new ideas to work out how to keep economies running and keeping people with enough money to live is becoming quite pressing. I noticed even today the federal government is again announcing changes to its various temporary work keeper and work seeker programs, and we'll get onto that later. But just in more generally, I'll spend just a couple of minutes explaining the whole universal basic income concept, if you want, and then of course throw over to the speakers who've got all the knowledge. And I suppose you could say that obviously this UBI idea has actually been around for years, centuries perhaps. It goes back to the 15th or 16th century in some examples, and it's suddenly become a bit more attractive to a whole bunch of people. And the really interesting thing is the range of people who think it's a good idea range from tech billionaires who think we should embrace it now. I'm not sure what their reasons are. Sometimes one might be that they're concerned about all the jobs that are being lost because of their what they do for a living and the robots are going to take over, or do they want the government to make sure that their consumers still have some money in their pockets to buy their products, so they're either feeling guilty or altruistic, I'm not sure. There are small government proponents who see it as an idea to give people some money, tell them to look after themselves and start reducing government services. In other words, give them more responsibility. Many on the left fairly traditionally have seen it as a way to even out the wealth in a community, and I think many in between, and I suspect many here, recognise that the current system is punitive in many ways, and it can be demeaning for lots of people, and it's hard work for those within certain sectors of the economy, and is there something in UBI that people might be able to use? And as I say, this COVID crisis brings new urgency to this concept. But of course, very easy to say, what a dumb idea. The first thing that gets in the way, of course, is the sheer cost, depending on your models. And I know Simon has some numbers he might use, will use later. You could be spending $50 or $100 billion quite easily, which is sort of getting up towards what the government is collecting already in taxes. And even if you can find the source of income, how do you then convince people, especially those who are going to get soaked by these new taxes, that it's a good idea to take their money and give it to someone else who may or may not be working? And that can go all the way from the deadbeat on the corner to Gina Reinhardt, because the model says universal. And but that's the practical stuff, and we'll try to get into that later. But there's, at its very basis, there's sort of, you know, a theory to ask yourself, is it actually conceptually a good or bad idea for society to make sure everyone's got enough money to live, basically, and without strings? And it's really that question: are you running the risk of are you freeing people up to find their own fortune and future, and it helps society, or are you running the risk of producing a community of people who will learn not to work for a living, or all those sorts of things? I mean, it's you can start and finish the debate right there, but that's only part of it. But I think the first thing and the best thing at the moment is I'm just going to hand over to our speakers. I'll sit down and ask them individually to just spend a couple of minutes introducing themselves. We'll spend some time, as I say, on the theory, and then the practical stuff. We'll talk about funding, talk about the other examples of UBI that have or haven't worked, and then more or less the whole point of the evening, we'll then try to find some way to get some common ground, and we also plan to leave plenty of time for questions. So, and when that comes around, by all means, if you have a point to make, feel free to make it. Try to keep it to a sentence or two, but the purpose of tonight is, as you've heard, is dialogue. So with that, welcome again, and I'll sit down and invite, probably from the end, Gigi, if you spend just a minute or two, we'll go from there. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Bob. Oh, this is on. That's good. So as introduced, I'm a professor at the University of New South Wales School of Economics, and I think I first got into the issue of UBI back in 2016 when I was asked by the Conversation editor at the time to write a piece on universal basic income, and I didn't know a whole lot about it at the time, but I'm a very broadly interested economist. Some people call me a behavioral economist. I like to think I'm just interested in people and groups and societies, and big ideas like power and love feature very prominently in my research. And the idea of a universal basic income lies squarely in the area of public economics, which is one of my graduate school fields. So I wrote a piece on the Conversation entitled something like UBI, the Dangerous Idea of 2016, and that essentially put me on the scoreboard in terms of readership on the Conversation. It was such a popular piece. And that was in late 2016, December 2016. And since then, the idea just does not die. And I have been asked to engage on it at various different fora, at various different levels, both in Sydney and elsewhere. So I'm very pleased to be discussing the issues here today. And I do think that we have a good chance of landing at a position with which we can all somewhat agree, maybe somewhat wincingly, but making some progress in actually thinking about the issues from a practical standpoint, I think would be a great service to the cause of progress in basically decision-making and policy information. Because at the moment, a lot of policy is made without that prior thoughtful exchange and really critical discussion and engagement with what are the political realities, what are the economic realities that we're facing, and how do we make them better? So,
thank you, Greg.
Yep. So I've came to the idea, I guess, in terms of basic income, because it was really self-interest. Because I was set an assignment topic in the early 1990s by my late great lecturer John Tomlinson, who I think Gigi's been on a forum at a politics in the pub session debating UBI, and the topic was, is a guaranteed minimum income, which was proposed by Ronald Henderson, a better idea than the targeted social security system? And of course, because I had a vested interest and knew what John's position is, I wrote in the affirmative, got a 7, and I've liked the idea ever since, really. But the other, I guess, part to me is the idea has merit, and I think I've kept an interest in it. And as Gigi said, it's often in crises that it becomes more topical. Obviously, before it was the automation debate a few years ago. Now it's the pandemic, and lots of governments around the world are looking at it. But my other kind of interest in this issue comes from spending a lot of time with people who, spend a lot of time at the bumpy bottom of the labour market or in unemployment benefits. So for the interest is not even so much the universal, but it's also the unconditional part of it as an alternative, as Bob was saying, to some of the kind of punitive, paternalistic aspects of the social security system. Yeah.
And John.
Thank you. Yes. I also came to the UBI in the 90s while studying. It was my thesis topic for my honours year in 99. It was an idea I'd always been interested in, but it was framed very differently when I read about it. It was the negative income tax, which some of you may have heard of as well. What some people haven't clued into is that the negative income tax is a type of UBI. So sometimes it's framed as, do you prefer the NIT or the UBI? We love our acronyms, right? The TLAs, the 3-letter acronyms. But sometimes the debate's framed as, do you prefer the NIT or the UBI? Which is really a misframing, because the NIT is a type of UBI. So now no one's saying negative income tax anymore, so I'm used to it. I can learn to change the words I use. So the universal basic income, it has been framed or promoted, as was mentioned earlier, by people from very different political backgrounds. And I guess I'm here as I described earlier, as I'm the evil market guy. I came to the idea from reading Milton Friedman as he promoted negative income tax in Free to Choose. And it's really, I've already said one false dichotomy in this debate. I really think also the idea of do you like the UBI can be very misleading, because there is a world of difference between a big UBI and a small UBI. To the degree that really the framing often splits down the line of do you want a bigger welfare state or a smaller welfare state? And then once you've answered that, you can talk about then your welfare state, do you want it framed as a UBI or as a more targeted type of welfare system? So when we come into this, I was, I think, nominally written down in the yes column. Simon was supposed to be the evil market guy in the no column. So Greg and I both came in here in the yes column, but I think we're going to end up promoting very different concepts of a UBI. So it kind of puts a pin in the idea of it's just a yes or no question. I think we're going to find, there's the old discussion of the way welfare is put together is you've got the trilemma. There's three things that you want and you can only have two of them. All right, so you can have generosity, you can have good incentives, and you can have affordability. And you need to pick the two you want. And I think what we're going to end up having here, I'm guessing, I haven't seen what they've got to say yet, is that we all pick a different two. All right, there are only three options. We've got three people. I think we're going to each pick a different one. I'm going to go with incentives and affordability. I think Gigi's going to go with affordability and generosity. And I think Greg's going to go with generosity and incentives. So we'll unpack that as we go. But I don't think there's two sides in this debate. I think we're going to end up having three very different positions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, as you see already, it's not quite a binary subject. You can choose either side and then you're going to have to work out how to reach common ground, which is why we're here tonight. But with that said, we'll start with the question of, is in theory a UBI a good idea? And that means, in theory, for the moment, we can sort of remove the money question, even though I know Simon raises it, certainly in his video. But if we start with the good, and Greg, I think you should have first shot.
That's good that you're starting with the good. That's why I get to speak first, right? So part of my argument, I guess, is that there are lots of other people that have thought about this. There's moral and religious leaders, as Bob was alluded to. In fact, in the Pope's Easter address, I think that now's the time, he said, for a universal basic wage, obviously in the context of COVID-19. There's a lot of history and thought about this with different ethical justifications, and all I wanted to do is just put out some of those arguments and reasons, because, as I said, much better minds than mine have kind of put these forward. I guess the kind of philosophical argument that's been made best is one by Philip von Paris, who sort of talks about this idea of maximum freedom. And for him, he doesn't just talk about negative liberties in terms of, freedom from unwarranted interference on the part of the state, what we would consider intrusive, but also in terms of positive freedom, that people need freedom to, not just freedom from. The idea of capabilities in Sen's work is a good example of that, right? That people need an economic floor, and that UBI gives them that in order to maximise those kinds of freedoms, right? Because, yes, we don't have a choice about where we're born, what class we're born, or what time we're born, and so this becomes some way of trying to smooth over some of those differences and give people a basic level of economic security, and that this has a lot of benefits, and that's where they go in terms of the benefits. Could be that people who are less worried, less anxious, make better democratic subjects. They've got more mental bandwidth to think about the sorts of issues that you want to have a conversation about in the Brisbane Dialogues, like climate change, for example. Whereas anyone who's economically, very in dice, struggling, it doesn't have that capacity to think well about these kinds of issues. It also means that they're more likely to vote for the sorts of tyrants and demagogues, leaders that have that kind of populist appeal. So there's an argument, for example, that UBI helps to thicken democracy. It's like Gravox, just add water, and we can have a better democracy. So that's one of the benefits of that maximising freedom argument, at least. There is, of course, much more pragmatic arguments that are put forward. We talked about automation really quickly, that obviously it's not about the robots taking every job, but AI and automation is disrupting work, it's changing the way in which people work, and the rewards of that process are going to be uneven. So even if it doesn't take jobs, there is likely to be increased casualisation from this process, right? So, and we can't assume just because we resolved this crisis in the past in terms of technology by generating new jobs, that that's how this is going to play out in the future, because these are very different technologies. So that's why you get the tech entrepreneurs putting the argument forward, like Martin Ford, perhaps just to make us buy his apps, so that we've still got money to do that, but at least there's this kind of strange bedfellows in this argument and philosophical and pragmatic case for UBI. But for me as well, as I said, there's the argument too is just about the way in which the current system has lots of unintended consequences in terms of social security. It's categorical, there are lots of losers. We know that, for example, when we're extending the job seeker supplement at the moment, that there are people that are missing out, similarly with JobKeeper. So yes, we've got a very efficient social security system that gets the money to the most poor in the community, but the way in which it does that can create a whole lot of harms, and it's worth us talking a little bit about that perhaps in a moment. In terms of other points, I just wanted to raise that the other thing it does, I guess, from a feminist point of view, as another philosophical perspective, is that it recognises all forms of work, not just labour, right? So that all the care work, all the work that gets done in making the world go round, care for self, care for others, care for the environment, there is an argument that this recognises that form of work and not just labour. And there are some feminists that would take this argument even further to say that what it does is hold a kind of beacon or a spotlight on the present, to say we should be contesting this kind of wage-centred labourist society because it not only makes all of those other things invisible, but it really does diminish what it means to be human and what it means to have a good society, right? The whole fetishisation of the work ethic, is a real product of the Industrial Revolution, in fact. Much older ideas around what constitutes a good life, you go back as far as Greece. And so what we've done is kind of focusing on that paid work ethic is diminish all the other forms of work, and that the UBI at least recognises that, but also is a kind of social dividend to say that even all the wealth that I might have is not just because of what I've done in this lifetime, it's intergenerational, right? So there's a social dividend argument about the common wealth and the common good that every citizen should have a share of. So that's just, I think, some of the main philosophical and ethical arguments that are put forward for UBI.
Now, John, are you happy to argue for the 4 at the moment?
Yes, I'm still going to argue for the idea of UBI. I'm just going to, I guess, lean against nearly all of those reasons for it. And this comes down to the idea of how generous you imagine the UBI being. So if you imagine it as more generous, then a lot of those arguments get on the table. If you imagine it, as I do, as being less generous than the current New Start, then the argument for is a very different argument. Right? It's not about improving the quality of the life as the person living on it. So this is a very different argument I'll be laying out now, and that is, it's my belief that the best cure for poverty isn't a better welfare system, but a job. And the greatest virtue of the UBI, or the negative income tax, in my opinion, is because it is not taken away, or therefore, I'll start that again. Because it's not taken away, it decreases the effective marginal tax rate. It improves the incentive for people to continue to earn more. It addresses what I consider to be the biggest problem of the current welfare system, which is high effective marginal tax rates, where when people go from earning 10 to 20 to 30 to 40,000, they're paying marginal tax rates of 60, 70, 80%, which is a great disincentive against getting the job. So the solution to that, in my mind, is that I want there to be more welfare for the working poor. I'd prefer less welfare for the non-working poor. It makes me sound mean. It's not because I don't like them, it's because I want to help them get a job. And more welfare for the working poor. That does a couple of things. Firstly, by more welfare for the working poor, that's what lowers the effective marginal tax rate, increasing the incentive to get a job. And secondly, and bear with me before you shake your heads, if we're giving more welfare to the working poor, that, in my mind, can justify a reduction in the minimum wage. If we reduce the minimum wage by 10%, someone on $40,000, the minimum wage at the moment, would go down to $36,000. But then if we give them welfare, working poor welfare of $5,000 or $6,000, they're better off. They're better off, but the minimum wage has gone down. And this is where we'd have to get into the esoteric details of the elasticity, the minimum wage elasticity of labour demand. But we've got fairly good evidence that that's about negative 0.2 to negative 0.3 in Australia, which means a 10% cut in the minimum wage would be about 300,000 to 400,000 new jobs. So my argument for the UBI is that it creates 400,000 new jobs and creates the incentive for people to take it.
Thank you very much. Now we'll get on to the question of, is it a bad idea in theory? And at this point, as we heard, Simon was unable to join us tonight, but he very kindly did record a video, which actually has some big numbers in it and also sets the scene for the current state of the social welfare system. That gives you some context to work with. So if we could switch to the video for a minute. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Simon Cowan, Research Director at the Centre for Independent Studies and author of UBI, Universal Basic Income is an Unbelievably Bad Idea. I know that tips my hand somewhat, but as I couldn't be here in person today because of COVID, I thought I'd give you some background, as neutrally as I can, on some of the issues that you're about to hear about tonight. The first point is that the federal government spends just over $500 billion a year, or at least they did before COVID. And of that money, $180 billion is spent on social security and welfare. When you add $80 billion on health and $40 billion on education, the total welfare state amounts to about 60% of federal government spending. Social security and welfare accounts for 8 of the top 20 government spending programs. But it's important to understand that when we talk about welfare, we mean a lot more than just the dole. In fact, the dole is a relatively small portion of our welfare bill. The age pension clocks in first at nearly $50 billion, then aged care at $20 billion, family tax benefits at $18 billion, the DSP and NDIS at $17 billion apiece, while job seeker payments are just $11 billion a year, a fraction of our total welfare bill. When we look at the number of people on welfare too, those receiving job seeker payments are actually quite a small portion. By far the biggest portion are those in the age pension, nearly 2.5 million retirees, with 1.6 million of those on the full rate. By contrast, just 730,000 people are on Newstart, but there are also people on youth allowance and various parenting payments. If we break down the figures of those on Newstart a little bit more, we see that 20% of those on Newstart have been on Newstart for more than 5 years, around 160,000. But by contrast, 240,000 have been on the payment for less than a year. The average duration on Newstart is 3 years, but more than half people get off the payment within 12 months. The last point here, when we're talking about people who are in poverty and possibly in need of government support, are those who aren't working but might need some government support anyway. And there are 2 main categories there. The first is stay-at-home parents, and this is overwhelmingly women, and the second are students. So we see that more than 1 million people over the age of 15 are students, most of those full-time, and nearly 1.8 million people are either in what is described as home duties or as caring for children. When you add another 150,000 in voluntary employment and 250,000 in caring roles, you see a significant number of people who are outside the workforce but are performing social duties that may be of value to society. Now, some of these people are already eligible for income support, but others are not, either because of activity testing, where Newstart and other payments are designed for people who are looking for work, or because their family incomes are too high. Now, there's another area that is important here when we talk about unemployment. It's not so much who is unemployed now, but who may be unemployed in the future. And one of the big moves towards UBI is actually being driven by those who are concerned that technology will render people not just unemployed, but a significant portion of the workforce unemployable. Studies predict that job losses from AI and automation could be anywhere from 10% of the workforce through to 50%. Now, this is not a new problem, and historical evidence from the Industrial Revolution actually found that this was beneficial to workers in the long term. Rather than rendering them unemployable, it gave them better and higher paying jobs. So there's not a guarantee that technology will lock workers out of the workforce, but that threat is still there. The last concept that I want to raise in terms of welfare, unemployment and poverty is the idea of effective marginal tax rates. Now, this is the income that is lost by someone when they transition from unemployment benefits into paid work, and includes not just money that's now paid in tax on the new income, but also benefits that are lost as your income rises. For some categories, the effective marginal tax rate, the income lost from moving from unemployment to work can be as high as 80 cents in the dollar. This creates a significant disincentive to joining the workforce and creates what's called a welfare trap. Now, typically this isn't actually the problem for low income earners. They actually can't afford not to work anyway. This is, however, a very significant disincentive for partnered women re-entering the workforce after having kids. Now, advocates for UBI think that UBI can solve these problems and many, many others. As you may have guessed, I'm a sceptic, but it's over to your panel to hear why they think that this is a good idea. Thank you.
All right. Well, I guess that sets it up for Gigi, who has some fairly strong views about why a pure UBI or a UBI is not quite the right answer to solve some of those problems.
Sure. We should, I don't know if we want to clap for Simon. I was expecting a bit more of the argument against UBI rather than the facts and figures, but of course the facts and figures are very useful to give a sense of perspective. And I think one of the figures that Simon mentioned was this $180 billion that we currently spend on a variety of welfare programs, including the age pension and the New Start, or job seeker, what we want to call it now. And those kinds of programs are often what are targeted for replacement by the universal basic income, by those who advocate for the universal basic income, saying the government's role should be to distribute evenly across the whole population their sort of dividend of being a member of society. But if you take the name universal basic income seriously, then you are saying not only is it universal, so to every man and woman in society, perhaps from the time they turn 21 or 18 or something, but it is also basic. So it is not, in fact, what John was describing, which is essentially very similar to what we have in the United States, the earned income tax credit, where you're essentially trying to promote the idea of work by giving extra benefits or subsidies to those who have a reasonably low wage, because then it becomes even more advantageous for those people who are maybe on the margin of working versus staying on the dole to go ahead and work. And that does not generate a basic income. A basic income would be at a minimum something like $20,000 a year. This is at a minimum. And if you simply multiply $20,000 a year times the number of adults in Australia, you come up with a figure that's a lot higher than $180 billion, something more like $380 billion. So argument one against the UBI from across the political spectrum has been the cost. If you are serious about a basic income for everyone, providing that straight off the bat, you're talking about a huge increase in the amount that we spend as a government towards social welfare, social insurance programs. And of course, then the argument is, well, what would the money be coming from? What are we spending on now that we wouldn't be spending on if we were to transition to a universal basic income? And then all manner of things might be on the chopping block. Education, research and development support, infrastructure, you name your category of preferred government expenditure that you would like to axe in order to fund this. Now, you could make the argument that, oh no, we should actually be progressing towards a society in which a government like Australia's should have a bigger role in the economy. That's a different argument, and that's a significant departure from what we have now. $200 billion more presence in the economy is a lot, and I don't think that's going to be very politically palatable. It's one of the reasons that universal basic income really has been a non-starter in the political discussions at policy-making levels in Australia. So that's argument one, is the expense. Argument two is that compared to the sorts of programs we have now that Simon described and that probably many of you are familiar with, this would be, on the face of it, a regressive move. If you take the envelope that we currently use to distribute cash to those Australians who need it at times and places where they need it, and you instead distribute it equally across everyone, from the person on the street to Gina Reinhardt, get a nickel for every time her name comes up in a discussion, then you have made a regressive move. You have redistributed regressively, right? Away from the people who need it the most. And that's generally not something that, you know, a lot of people think is a good idea in an environment in which inequality has been rising, and we do have the same concerns that were raised by Greg in relation to people who are struggling to make ends meet. Do you, in that situation, take money away from the people who are arguably the most needy by the various checks that we have in place to allocate money through our transfer systems, and give it instead to people like me? I don't want a universal basic income, I don't need it, right? So we shouldn't be giving it to me. So that's the second argument, is it's a regressive move. The third argument is about work incentives. And this goes back to a bit of what John was saying. And the problem with the argument really is that no matter what you do, you cannot get away from a basic unavoidable fact, which is if the government gives money to anybody at any point on the income distribution, eventually it has to claw it back, because it's not affordable to give that same amount to every single person as per point 1, right? So at some point, if we want to be generous on the negative end of the income distribution, we have to claw it back as people's incomes go up. And that's true as much as for the negative income tax as it is for any other system, the earned income tax credit or anything else. And so the concern with UBI is in the same way that when we claw back money, we create a disincentive for people to earn more because it'll be that much more expensive. They're going into a higher tax bracket and they don't want to get there, so they're going to just shade their income. They're going to not work quite as much to try to get themselves on the right side of that budget set kink. You have the same problem at the very end where if you're just getting the money no matter what you do, then why does it matter whether you have a job? Right? And so this idea that it will disincentivize people from actually getting a job. And this leads into I think the most compelling argument against a UBI, which is that a universal basic income concept, although it may sound generous and progressive, it is expensive, regressive, and actually is throwing money at a problem whose causes are far, far deeper than a lack of money. The causes of poverty and the causes of disadvantage in this country have much more to do with big, broad, complex, messy problems related to human capital development, linking into the society, working out how to be confident in yourself and learn about yourself so that you can put yourself into the mix, figure out who you can trade with, who can supply your business, how to get a loan, any of these kinds of things that many people in the audience here will know because they were educated in the home or they've had a lot of experience and they know, but just throwing money at someone who has none of that knowledge and none of that capacity to enter a labor market because they're just outside the loop so much, that's not going to help them in the long run. So what we really need to do is take the money, instead of throwing it at people in checks, we need to take the money and confront some of these very, very complex and multi-layered problems of disadvantage in the society. And that involves a lot of work. And it involves people having conversations, whether it's in Indigenous communities or in places where they're dealing with disadvantaged children, and working out what are these problems and how can we help these people. So I think it's not that there aren't any problems in society, it's that throwing money at those problems is not always the right answer. So I think I'll stop there.
Thank you very much. John?
There is a lot to unpack in that. I thought Simon was going to say most of that stuff, but you I think, covered his arguments well. I think a lot of what you said there is a really good argument against what I'm going to call a big UBI. And I note that your argument against a small UBI basically amounted to, it doesn't count as basic. To give you an idea of, and I haven't run all these numbers properly, but I've got a mud map of what could work, is I'd be looking at something like $1,000 a month. So something very similar to Andrew Yang, except in Australian dollars, $12,000 a year. That is less than New Start. But I think, and you might say you don't like it because it's not generous enough, and you're certainly allowed to say that. But I don't think you're allowed to say it's not a universal basic income. It is. It might just be one that you don't like. And if you don't like that, then I think you'd have to give a reason against that, which I assume would be a reason against my lack of generosity. To which I would rebut that I think a big part of the solution of solving poverty, two parts I'd give to you. One is jobs, and I'll come back to that in a second. The other is individualized attention to the underlying problem of the person involved, to which I would say community welfare is infinitely better at doing that than government welfare. And they're not complements, they're substitutes. And this goes to perhaps a bigger philosophical discussion that would take us well off base for this hour. But that's my response to that side of things. Going back to the jobs, I wanted to pick up on one thing you said, that a negative income tax, or a UBI as I'd propose, still would have an effective marginal tax rate. Absolutely, it would. So the scheme that I've roughly put together for Australia, $12,000 per year, or $1,000 a month, would then be dragged back at 30% from the get-go, right? So abolishing the tax-free threshold effectively and putting in a 30%. So it's true, it has a 30% disincentive to work. The current system has a 70%. 30 is less than 70. That is good. I readily admit that there's still an effective marginal tax rate. I don't think any proponent of UBI or NIT has doubted that. But if we could decrease the effective marginal tax rate, we increase the incentive to get a job, and if we're going back to my earlier argument, made more jobs available to low-skilled workers or low-productivity workers, more jobs would exist, the incentive to take it would be higher, and I think that would do more to address poverty than either keeping the current system or introducing a big UBI, in which case then I'm suddenly switching sides and taking Gigi's side.
All right. We'll get on to the funding question in a second, but I know, Greg, you perhaps want to respond?
Oh, I mean, only just quickly, just in terms of defining our terms, that if we're going to talk about welfare, we need to factor in tax expenditures, because there's a whole lot of welfare that goes through the tax system that doesn't go through the cash transfer system in terms of Centrelink, negative gearing, superannuation tax concessions, capital gains tax exemptions. And they're not going to pay for a generous UBI, but I think they're going to have to be part of a discussion around what tax reform and widening the tax base would need to look like. Plus, if we're going to give Gina Rinehart the money, I mean, depending on how you design it, again, it can have net contributors and net beneficiaries, right? So Gina Rinehart, if we can get the tax out of her, and don't forget 73 millionaires, as it said on the weekend, paid zero tax in Australia last week. But if we got Gina to pay her tax, we would claw it back, right? And I'm less worried about the churn in the same way that Henderson was less worried about the churn in terms of paying and clawing back the tax, right, to some extent. So I think you have to do the tax reform, and we've not been very good at that in terms of this country of having a debate about tax. But the other thing I'd say is creeping into the discussion a little bit is that, yes, we need to address lots of underlying problems, and I've worked with employment services and other forms of assistance that tries to address the skills issue and the human capital problem. But I also think it's a misrepresentation to think that the answer to poverty is reforming character. I mean, addressing poverty is actually a problem of cash in the first instance. It really is. I mean, I spent 2 weeks in Harvey Bay and Bundaberg speaking to people who are very good at managing their money, but now they're told 80% of their income is quarantined on a card and they'll have 20% cash to spend. So you talk to single mums who had savings accounts for their kids, a saving account for themselves, this is pre-cashless debit card trials, and now they've got no savings, they're in debt, they're paying a poverty premium on getting things like skips delivered because the in-due card doesn't work, plus we pay $10,000 per person for that trial. Like, it's a complete waste of money, and all the evaluations have shown that to be the case. So we're throwing a lot of money at bad programs that don't address poverty. I would rather we worry about the underlying poverty in terms of the cash, and then on top of that, we need the wraparound social services, absolutely.
Can I just pick up on one quick thing there? In terms of churn, I think you're quite right, and that's really highlighted by the fact that if we frame a UBI as a negative income tax, the churn goes away, and all we've done is an accounting trick. Right? It's just a framing issue. As long as the tax is paid and the welfare received on the same fortnightly cycle, the UBI, as I imagine it, would be entirely run through the Australian Tax Office, the ATO anyway. So there could be accounting churn, there could be a churn according to the way you do accounting, if you want to call it a UBI, but it wouldn't be churn in reality, and you could just make the churn go away if you called it an NIT. So that's a nice solution. And in terms of the Gina Rinehart point, poor Gina, can we pick on anyone else that's rich too? There must be someone. That point is also, as you say, it's addressed by the fact that you can simply adjust the tax system to make sure there is no net gain to people higher up the totem pole. And to go back to the example that I was talking about before, if you had a $12,000 universal basic income and then a 30% tax on the first $40,000, that basic income is gone by the time you reach $40,000. So once you're earning $40,000, you're no longer receiving it. This is if you frame it as a negative income tax now. If you, once you reach $40,000, you're no longer receiving any benefit, but you're also not paying any tax, so you're still a lot better off than the current system. So that's really just, adjusting the tax system takes away that, but rich people are getting it too argument.
In which case, then, is it really a universal basic income? Is it really that different than what we have now? I mean, your proposal is because we are essentially not paying anybody who doesn't have a job anything, right? Whereas your proposal becomes much more like a targeted tax and transfer system because you are clawing it back at the top. And I think the idea that it is easy to adjust the tax system is fantastical. It is simply not. And if you're proposing that, well, we give more money to people lower down in the income chain and take more money from people who are higher up, yeah, I think that's a good idea. But I think the idea that we can simply package that as universal basic income plus a whole lot of really complex tax reforms that just haven't gotten passed for decades, that's not realistic. So my concern is more that, okay, we've got these super top earners who are earning crazy amounts of money. figuring out how to get some of that back through things like wealth taxes or inheritance taxes or some other proposal, right? That should be decoupled from UBI, because UBI, or whatever you want to call it, more progressive treatment of people at the bottom of the income distribution, is essentially going to be seen as a different political animal. Doing those two things at once, I just don't see the feasibility of it.
I just clarify, I was certainly not suggesting we increase tax at the top. That wouldn't be something I would say. As you remember before, my argument
It's something
was,
I'd say.
Yeah,
yes,
exactly.
quite right. I was suggesting we give less welfare to people without a job, more welfare to people with a job. So I want to, the main thing I'll keep coming back to, and the thing that I'll try and gather support for later, is the idea that I want more welfare for the working poor. I want to target the working poor. I think that's where we need to target. I think they're going to be the people suffering from the tech revolution if it happens. And I'm not saying tax the rich more to do it. I'm saying give less to people without a job so you can give more to people with a job.
No, it was definitely Greg who said that.
That's actually a question I had for later, but if we're talking about raising more money somehow in the system, how do you actually convince anyone who's going to get, as I said earlier, get soaked by this new system that it's a good idea? Have we done research on how to say to people, we can go and knock on Gina Reinhardt's door, I guess, and ask for the money, but just look at what happened with royalty taxes, mining taxes, any other form of tax increase gets met with all sorts of objections, not just from the peak bodies but basically anyone who is paying more tax doesn't like it.
So let me address the elephant in the living room, perhaps, which is the modern monetary theory perspective on all of this, which is that if we are talking about the Commonwealth government, which is the currency issuing body in Australia, doing the paying of the universal basic income or whatever it ends up being, and also doing the taxing, then there is actually no need for the tax side of the ledger to equal the expenditure side of the ledger for any purpose, because they can always just print more money. And of course, we've seen what happens in the ultimate, awful state of the world in South American examples, where there isn't a particularly large amount of fiscal responsibility, and you end up having inflation that goes runaway and destroys your economy. But in a society like Australia's, where we've seen those kinds of historical examples, and we understand the need to calibrate the amount of money flowing around in the economy to the amount of activity happening economically, there is this argument. Not saying that it's necessarily one you have to buy in order to be against UBI, but there is an argument that says you don't need to worry about raising the same amount in tax that you're paying extra for the UBI if you are the currency issuer, because taxation is simply about soaking spending power out of the economy. And you can do that more from the rich. In fact, you should do it more from the rich, sorry, John, if you think you want more spending to happen on goods and services, like coming out of a recession, for example, where you want a high propensity to consume amongst those people you give the extra dollars to. And we know that the poor have a much higher propensity to consume. Every dollar they get, they're more likely to spend a large amount of it on spending on, goods and services, rather than, putting it away in the Cayman Islands or whatever, which the rich is more likely to do, or taking trips abroad where other countries get those benefits. So this coupling, again, of the taxation system and the UBI system, I think, is a little bit artificial, potentially.
Okay. As I mentioned earlier, there are cases of UBI working around the world in various forms and shapes. But before we get to that, just on the funding or the cost of it all, Greg, is there anything you want to add to that?
Well, only to say that in terms of the reciprocity, and there's a cultural feasibility question as well, not just in terms of an economic incentive, but if you have basic reciprocity and people, because we seem to hold two ideas simultaneously, that is that people need to be forced to work, or that work is inherent to the human condition and we're going to make a contribution. Now, I guess the basic principle of universal basic income is that to some extent you're going to trust that people are going to do the right thing. There will be a small proportion that won't, but that also shouldn't be the basis upon which we make public policy decisions. And also that the time at which they might be making a poor choice, they're not penalised as heavily for it, right? Because I think risk and security are two sides of the same coin, particularly when you're talking about the emerging gig economy. You want people to make some mistakes. You want them to be entrepreneurial, but not be punished or be forced into destitution as a result of that. So to some extent, that kind of flaw promotes that, I think. And just on the question of social attitudes, we're not the US, right? We don't see taxation as a form of theft in the same way, right? If you look at Australian attitudes on all sorts of social issues, we generally, as long as we know what the purpose of that tax is going for, we're prepared, in the most part, to have a discussion and a debate about it. What we lack is actually political leadership on those issues. Or that's why the whole previous election was such a debacle. It wasn't that they were good, some of those were good policy proposals in and of themselves, but there was no narrative about that. Like, where do we want to go? Where do we want to land? Right? And that's the whole point of a utopian discussion, as much as it's seen as fanciful, is that that problematises the present. It breaks our habits of thinking, but it also points to possibilities of where we might go forward. And then this is the other issue I had with the whole, nature of paid work, is that there's lots of other things that makes an enriching life. I mean, we're having this discussion in the Tivoli. It's an arts venue, right? I mean, this is what enriches people's lives and enables them to do other sorts of things than if we weren't, or completely driven. But the marker and significance of a meaningful life is that we work 9 to 5. Right. And there's lots of other things that we should count. Yeah.
Can I just add, I guess as the only woman on the stage, I do think that many other things count, and that those of us who have thought about it for more than 2 seconds will realize that A, people are extremely competitive, and they will compete about something, whatever that thing is, right? And B, the source of most people's greatest happiness is their close human relationships. And indeed, those come from communities, as John was saying before, right, largely. And so the idea that we don't monetarily reward things like child rearing or cleaning the house or whatnot, that's sort of almost incidental. In some sense, if you really think that we should pay money for everything, then you are elevating the idea of money as being, in fact, where the score is kept. Whereas, I think, again, I don't, and I think many other people don't really believe that. But it does serve as a focal point for people to compete with each other in a positive way. And one of the things I worry about is if we take away that idea of, yes, you should contribute to your society in a way that recognizes your contribution, whether that's monetary recognition or non-monetary recognition, you should contribute, you should have that. That is a foundation of people's self-esteem. If we take that away, we know what happens. People get spoiled. And it happens at the bottom of the distribution and at the top. People who inherit money and never have to work become spoiled brats. People who are born into welfare systems that just generate more and more money coming in, no matter what happens, that can be bad for them as well, because inherently there's an insecurity about, am I good enough? I don't have to prove myself in any way in order to get this money. What does that mean about me? That means that I'm not expected to contribute anything? I can't? I mean, it raises all sorts of questions about the fundamental value of that person in his own mind or her own mind. And so I think, and then it starts to bleed into, well, how can I compete with others? Oh, well, I can compete in terms of how many people can I rob, or how many people can I delude, or can I do this to, or how many cars do I have, or some other non-productive competitive area. So I feel humans' competitive instinct is innate and barely manipulable, and that competing on paid work and value in society more broadly is actually not a bad way to focus the mind.
So you should have been quite convinced by my argument for jobs. When you said before that people get a lot of the value from the communities they have, quite right. A lot of the communities we have come from our work. As well, for a lot of people, their sense of accomplishment, their sense of achievement, their sense of dignity comes from being effective at a job that they think matters. So not a giveaway job that they know is fake and was just made up to make them feel better, but a job that they earned. So I think people get dignity from that. One thing I'd like to pick up, and this is, I guess, a common bugbear that all economists must have when other people talk about what they think economists think. No one thinks that people are money maximizers. Literally no one. I mean, even people far more evil than me on the evil spectrum of the preferring markets, no one thinks humans are money maximizers. Economics, we talk about people being utility maximizers, which is basically a philosophical wank word for saying happiness maximizers. Right? So we understand that very well. And the goal of getting people a job, to my mind, isn't that we need to make sure everyone gets as rich as possible. I say this to you as someone who hasn't had a proper full-time job for 16 years, intentionally, because I like spare time. And yet at the same time, I know that a job is very important for the well-being of people that are falling through the cracks at the moment.
Greg, any more? No. I think we can talk round and round about the funding, and obviously it raises, as we've said, all sorts of questions about the current state of the tax system. How can you change it? And clearly it's a debate that it will fill a whole audience and a whole other event for another occasion. But I think it's probably worthwhile now looking at, UBI has actually been sort of on the cards in one form or another goes back centuries. And I just thought we might spend a little bit of time just talking about what we might learn from what other countries have done and other experiments. And Greg, would you like to start that?
Sure, I'm sure I'll start, and then I think John and Gigi can kick in, because there's a lot of activity going on at the moment. Obviously, we've got countries that are looking at this right now. Spain's just introduced, I think, a basic income. And we've had experiments also in Finland that have ended recently, which was for 2,000 randomly selected unemployed people, giving the equivalent again of about $1,200 a month, and a randomised controlled trial group that received no income. So in all of these studies, it's important to note, though, that they're not universal because it's not a natural experiment. Not everyone in the population gets it, right? They're very segmented, targeted populations where they're trying to monitor the work incentives, the health effects, education and participation. So it's not universal. I mean, the only way in which we would trial a universal experiment would be to get it out of every citizen and see what happens, right? So they are very kind of contained, and there are lots of qualifications you need to make about that. They've been going on, though, since the 70s, and there is a lot of evidence, particularly in the MinCom study in Manitoba, which was the biggest really that ran in the 70s. There was some really good positive health effects in terms of less people going to hospital, so there was less psychiatric assessments, people's mental health improved. There was an impact on work, and I think there's been a meta-analysis about this, that it does have an effect on supply. It can vary from, very small 0.5 up to 9%, depending on also on what gender we're talking about. There is evidence that women did dip out of the paid workforce to raise young kids, and that young people stayed at school longer, for example, or decided to go to university. In the developing world, there's been bigger studies, and obviously your money goes a lot further on a basic income study in places like India or Kenya. In those places, very transformative, right? So in the first year, yes, you see those same effects, but in year 2 and 3, then you start to see that people get pooling their income. They buy sewing machines, they start sewing clothes. They pay off the debtor, so they're no longer in debt. They put fish in the dam and sell those at market. So there's a whole lot of kind of collective or societal dynamics that start to unfold in these quite remote villages, nonetheless. These are not urban settings, but really quite interesting, not just individual effects, which is what we've been talking about, but what are the collective dynamics that start to get unleashed by this? So if we scaled it up, I think there's enough evidence to say that you could see some of these same effects. But again, it would depend on the kind of society that you've got, the notions of what we think we owe each other, all of those things. But I think there's enough evidence to suggest that we could do it and not be too concerned about the particular effect on work, that we would see some health impacts positively. We would see people increase education, undertake some care work. So I think the case for it on the trials that are run to date and are running at the moment would suggest that, they're not reason to say no on the basis of the trials.
Okay. Gigi, what do you draw from it?
So I think there's a very important distinction to be made between developing country and developed country UBI trials, and also the point that you made very well, Greg, which is that the trials that have run in the developed world, particularly the recent ones, really have not been universal basic income trials. They have been more like unconditional cash payments to our unemployed at the moment trials. Very different. It's just very different. And if you look at the evaluation of the Finnish trial, which ended and, as you said recently, and wasn't actually renewed for funding, it did have positive mental health effects on the financial security, self-perceived amongst the recipients, and a slight employment effect as well, so slightly more people going back to work. I think that was where your 0.5% figure came from. But those are nice, but the idea that one would then say, on the basis of this result, of this evidence, we are going to now institute a universal payment to everyone, not just the unemployed, right? And somehow garner these massive benefits. That was something that the government there decided was not going to work, right? So the evaluation of the trial indicated to me, and the fact that they didn't renew it indicated, okay, well, nice idea, but we don't really know how this is going to play out, what benefits we're going to get if we extend this to the entire population. Now, could they have replaced their existing unemployment insurance scheme with this unconditional cash payment scheme? They could have done that, but I think, again, they're thinking, well, we're also maybe in the longer run depressing work incentives. We're not sure. In the short run, it seemed to work well, but what's going to happen if we change this sort of scenario whereby, well, if you're unemployed, you just get a check? Will that encourage more people to just become unemployed instead of getting a job? And there's probably a lot of unanswered questions there because the trial really wasn't about that sort of broader change. It was just this one cohort. Now, in the developing world, yes, you've got a lot of suffering people, close to the bone, no margin for error, kids who are on the brink of not being nourished properly. Sure, if you do a cash drop there, you're going to have some good effects, right? Big effects and good effects. But those things were financed not by the governments, but by UNICEF and Give Directly, as I remember. And that's great, but that's just basically a targeted type of charity, which is a helicopter money drop. And yeah, I think that would probably work well until the corrupt governments in charge worked out how to tax it back somehow. Because generally speaking, a lot of the problems in the developing world have to do with the corruption of governments. That's why the governments aren't the ones doing the trials. Right? The savior from outside comes in and says, the charitable organization, and says, okay, I'm going to just isolate this village. These are the lucky ones. Here you go. Here's some money. Lovely idea, but scalability-wise, and in terms of practical, ability for the Indian government or the Kenyan government to take this on as a mantra and say, well, we're going to just give this money to everyone, is not feasible. So I think it's a nice idea for a nice, heartwarming story, but it's not the solution to the development problem. And I also don't think it's the solution in the developed world if you're talking about a proper universal basic income. Now, I do think the positive results in terms of security, financial security, and confidence even, in the finished trial are an interesting result. And there may be some way that we could tweak our existing programs to provide more of that sort of thing, more security. And I actually like the idea of providing a mechanism through which the government can take onto its shoulders the downside risk of whatever might happen in the future. So you know how the HEC scheme finances education? Well, one of the things that Bruce Chapman, who is the grandfather of HECS, as you know, has proposed to get us out of this recession, or to at least assist in that, is to offer HECS-type contingent loans, income contingent or revenue contingent loans, to people or businesses who aren't certain about their future, aren't sure whether they're going to have a job, or if they're a business, whether they're going to be in business in 12 months. If you offered them an income contingent or revenue contingent loan, that might provide that security in this period at least, and then get them back on their feet. Maybe we can use that sort of idea to not just hand out checks, John, and to people who don't have jobs, but to offer sort of a bargain. Maybe it's not entirely taken onto the shoulders of government, the downside risk, but to some extent. So you're offering a bit of help, a bit of encouragement without just breaking the bank and without making it such that the person is not expected to do anything to get this money.
So much, again. Wow. I don't know which parts. I was about to respond with, we're in furious agreement, and then I think we disagree, and then we're in furious agreement again. I just can't remember to which points they were to now. I think we all agree that in terms of how to interpret the evidence doesn't tell us enough to be able to say yay or nay. I suspect we all agree on that. The evidence from the developing countries don't help us much in a developed country, and the evidence in developed countries, well, they're not evidence of a UBI as either of us imagine it. And that makes sense, right? It's going to be hard to have an actual trial of a UBI the way either of us imagine it. Because how do you do a trial where you ask, say, one city in Australia, would you like to do a trial where you get less welfare? I mean, they're not going to trial my way and let everywhere else have higher welfare. And to be able to trial a proper UBI is going to be prohibitively expensive. So, but anyway, I think we can agree that we can't rule it in or out because of the evidence from the trials so far. On your last point there, what do you say there, income contingent loans? Perhaps we're going to be getting to something we can find agreement on. You planned this, didn't you?
Not at all.
That also sounds very similar to something known as personal equity contracts, which I'm not sure if either of you have heard of much before. Passion of mine, I actually run a charity in Cambodia that arranges personal equity finance to give money to kids, university students, I still call them kids, using that sort of contract, that sort of system, like an income contingent loan. So I think we might be able to find some common ground there.
Greg, any more? No, because we're getting close to the common ground section, but feel free.
I mean, only to say that, it wasn't just because the government didn't think it was a good idea. They were politically motivated decisions in the case of Canada and in the case of Finland. And it's often the case in public policy that it's the politics that trumps the evidence in many cases, and that's the real politic of public policy making. And as George Lakoff, the cognitive scientist, would say, that's because partly frames matter more than facts. So we seek out the facts in the same way we're doing tonight about the sort of evidence we might glean from a trial about whether it's a good idea or not, right? But also to say that no one ever talks about this happening tomorrow if we're going to move to a universal basic income. We all accept that, like social justice, it's a kind of distant horizon that one's aiming at, and you would have to take small steps to get there. It's what some UBI advocates call a stepping stone approach. So you might start with young people who have a bumpy transition between school and work, or school and higher education, right? So you say 20 to 24-year-olds, let's have a basic income for those guys. Problem with that, though, is that politically a lot of young people don't get that much support, right? But that is a group that suffers, as do mature age workers who are facing discrimination in the labour market. So you could start with some groups, but no one thinks we're going to do it tomorrow. It's not a Nike commercial of just do it, because it's a complex thing to do. Yeah.
I suppose we've actually got it right at the moment as sort of a forced on us experiment in a version of universal basic income with job keeper program, and it's changing by the day. It's costing $70 billion or so for 6 months, and I'm just wondering if the panel has yet drawn any conclusions or observations about what's happening in the real world at the moment.
Just quickly, not job keeper, because Gigi might want to say something about that, but on job seeker, ACOS did a study because of the additional supplement that people have got. That they're spending it on kind of essential utilities, and they're generally spending it on the things that you would expect them to spend on, not frivolous items. And so it's hard to see, if we get to what the common ground is, that even if we don't have a universal payment, which we're not going to land on as a common ground tonight, but that New Start won't go back to what it was, right? Because poverty at that level is a disabling force. It doesn't enable or encourage people to get a job. They can't buy clothes, they can't buy bus tickets. That level at which New Start was paid is a historical anomaly between the way in which we index pensions and index allowances. And it's also based historically on the idea that unemployment is a temporary phenomenon. And since the 70s, that's not been the case.
I hope that wasn't angling for the point of agreement, because no, I think it was a mistake to double New Start. I don't think that addressed the underlying problem that's happening for coronavirus. And anyway, and also, I guess the bigger point here is I don't think that echoes a UBI in any way. Right. So if you earn more, you are going to receive less, and it doesn't go to everyone without conditionality. Indeed, we didn't really get to it now, but the conditionality of welfare is a big sticking point that has several points both on the for and the against side. I think on balance, the for side can win, but it's we didn't really get to much discussion of that here. But the job seeker is not unconditional, so I mean, my wife doesn't get it. I don't.
Well,
get
except they suspended the conditions during the payment period up until they're only starting to phase them back in, right? So yes, normally New Start has a whole lot of conditions attached, but for the moment they've suspended those conditions.
On JobKeeper, I actually think that the most attractive element of that program was that it kept together people who were already in a job and the employers, right? Rather than simply giving money to whoever happened to not be in a job at the time. And so that lack of severing that link, I think, is what is going to have helped the most through this horror period, and will hopefully be able to get us out of the recession a little bit more quickly. Of course, the longer the lockdowns and the craziness happen, the less likely that particular job is going to be needed on the other side of the crisis, and so that person may not be taken up in job again. But it was certainly a good idea at the time to keep together those employers and employees, and that's actually the networking that we were talking about earlier. This idea that it's actually the connection into the labor market that a lot of people who don't have a job really need help with. Right? Not just money, not just a handout, but how do I fish, right? And that was basically saying, okay, I'm going to keep you holding this fishing rod, right, for a little while anyway, and then hopefully on the other side of this you can keep fishing. And so I liked that aspect of the program a lot. In terms of what to expect on Thursday's announcement, I do expect the government will start to target the program more, because the biggest feature of this, of course, was the blanket policy. As you said, $1,500 a fortnight, no matter what your wage was. If it was a lot less, you get that amount, and if it was a lot more, you still get that amount. And I think they'll target it probably on the basis of industry. We know certain industries have been very heavily affected. I think they'll probably also change the payment in arrears aspect of it, because that's been heavily criticized by the employer groups. But I think there's no way that they're going to let people just fall off a cliff at the end of September.
Sorry, there may be a bit of cross-purpose here. The JobKeeper one, I agree that made sense. The job seeker one, those people are already getting New Start and they're already living on New Start, so doubling their New Start didn't address the problem being caused by COVID, which was new people losing their jobs. And the 1,500, that wasn't what I was referring to when I was saying that the top-up for JobKeeper, because there was also a top-up for JobKeeper, which you do lose as you earn more income, which is the whole point of not being a UBI. So it wasn't a UBI, it was a top-up of welfare, temporary. And I got to say also, the making it easier to get job seeker in the midst of this crisis also made sense to me. So I'm not purely evil.
Well, thank you. We're getting closer to the panel's time before we throw over to the audience, but I suppose here's the tricky bit. Is there any common ground? And perhaps the first that I thought is, can we actually agree on what needs fixing in the current system?
I suspect we all, there's probably lots of things we don't agree on in terms of fixing things in the current system, but I suspect we probably all don't like the 60, 70, 80% effective marginal tax rates creating a poverty trap for people earning in the range of $10,000 to $30,000.
Yep, I think that's right. A bad thing, definitely.
Sure.
And what would it take to fix that? Who do we have to convince?
Negative income tax.
You either need to give less welfare to the people without a job or more welfare to the people with a job, or both.
All right.
I mean, in the US, we have this earned income tax credit, and that basically is part of the idea of that.
Right.
It is, try to subsidize people, pay them a little extra when they get that first dollar of income. The government chips in a bit more, right? And that does encourage people to enter the labor market. That's very clear. The problem, again, is that you eventually have to claw back at some stage. And I know that John will say, oh, well, it's less than. At some stage, you have to claw it back, wherever it is. By $40,000 a year, you've clawed it all back in your world. So it really goes into the details. You have to draw out the budget constraint and figure out, well, where are all the kinks and where are people going to bunch and how can I minimize this effect, right? But it will be there no matter what. We just have to distribute it in some way that's as minimally disruptive as possible, right? And I think we could probably agree about that.
Greg, how do you feel about that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think don't know whether we'll agree on this or not, but I do think we talk a lot about the problem of the welfare system. We don't talk enough about the problem of the labour market. We're going to come out better from this crisis partly because we've got some decent protections around workers and decent protections around arbitration and conciliation, where that's why the US is going to come out much worse than we are, despite how much money they're throwing at it. Lots of people are going to lose their job, right? So we've got a reasonable labour market, but there's still lots of issues that would need to be addressed. We are still heavily casualised, and that's likely to increase. So, some form of way in which people are both, we have this problem of overemployment, underemployment. People who've got salary jobs are working longer hours, people who want more hours can't get enough. And so UBI is perhaps part of a plank of a way in which we can address some of those issues, but we should also be having a conversation about how do we think about redistributing paid working hours and some of those proposals, for example. It's not a silver bullet, it has to be with a whole bunch of other things. Yeah.
Would you identify something we could all agree on?
I've got one idea that I definitely want to say before we finish, but just before I come to that, I wonder, you said before that your version of a UBI is a long-term plan, understandable. And you mentioned a few short-term stepping stones. Would you think something like what I've been talking about could be a stepping stone, or would it be a regressive step in your mind?
A negative income tax?
At the levels that I've been talking about, so like $1,000 a month, so $12,000 a year, and then the tax rate of 30% above that, so the effective marginal tax rate comes down to 30%.
I mean, I think in terms of that proposal, it makes sense in terms of addressing the problems of the effective marginal tax rates. The negative income tax, works depending on what level you set it at before people start to lose. If you set it's $15,000 and you earn $7,000, then you'll get an $8,000 effectively a tax credit. That's okay. But for me, the rate payment has to be generous enough to address the poverty issue, right? And I don't know whether that would do it because it does rely on people having to get that part-time paid work. And also enough that it increases both exit and voice for workers. Because I think that's the societal dimension to this, potentially in the labour market, is that it changes the relationship between capital and labour depending on what rate the UBI is paid. So people may not need to be driven to dangerous and dirty jobs. Employers might create jobs that are actually attractive. And this is the ecological argument. I don't know whether we'll agree on this or not, but there is an ecological argument made for UBI as well, in the sense that, people could be in the same way in which we did in COVID. If there's less mobility for workers, transport and housing are really big contributors to greenhouse gases. Then you could foster a localism and a little bit of this way in which we thought about slow food, a little bit of that slow time movement, for example, right? So it could be consistent with an ecological imperative, but that, again, would need to test that effect in terms of putting it in place. But
Sure. Okay.
it's got to be, for me, it's got to address poverty.
Yeah.
It can't be low enough.
Fair enough. I think you saw that one coming.
One other area we might agree on, I'm not sure, is that the problems of poverty are multifaceted, multidimensional, not just about money. And John, you haven't really talked too much about what you would do with people who can't find a job. But I might suggest that maybe you would support programs that would try to integrate them more with their communities, to try to link them with employers, to try to maybe provide the kinds of resources that they would need to try to send out resumes or go to interviews or whatever the thing is that they need to do. And I think this is just a very, very difficult problem to solve, particularly in remote communities. And it's not helped by the layers of administration to access our existing transfer system that we haven't even spoken about today, but often comes up in discussions of UBI, which is, well, we have all this machinery you have to liaise with and go through in order to even access any money, and why do we have to have that? How about we just give everybody a check? And I actually think that is an argument for some kind of simplification, and whether we make that into an argument for a national bank where people can just get money added automatically without having to prove something, or whether we say, look, there are no work search tests for the first 2 years, or whatever we say, but something that helps people to more easily integrate with the systems that are trying to help them and the labour market where we ultimately do want them to be, of course. I agree with you, John, about that. So some sort of community-based, because you like community, networking, assistance, support, I don't know whether to call it charity or government, philanthropy.
So the point you were making about the conditionality is a good one, and I think that's probably something that if we could make it work, we'd all have a bit of sympathy. At the moment, the approach to disincentivizing people to take welfare seems to be offer them New Start and then make their life as miserable as possible and hope that stops them taking it out. So New Start's currently worth $15,000 a year, and I'm making this number upcoming, but imagine that the hassle that they're doing, that the cost of the hassle on people taking out New Start. If that to them is $3,000 worth of disutility, offering them no hassle and giving them $12,000 leaves them just as well off and saves us all $3,000 a person, which we can use on boosting the welfare for the working poor instead. So maybe there's some agreement there. In terms of community welfare, I think, Murray, you'll have to do a whole other session for that. It's a topic that I love ranting about, but I need a few hours on a soapbox for that one. But yes, I've got a big interest in finding innovative community-based solutions to how to help people. I've got a bugbear about the idea that people have in their mind, if you want to help people, it must be through government. You vote once every 3 years, and that's the end of your duty. You walk away and think you've done good. I think it's much better to... I think it's more effective to help solve underlying problems through community welfare programs and connections. But that's a huge topic.
Before we cast to the audience, and this might be just fractionally unfair, but how would you sell your key idea to a politician to get them to take it up? Have you got any thoughts? Because I'm cheating a bit here, it's professional interest on my part, but I think that idea of selling simplicity and saying to politicians you can remove a whole bunch of problems and not end up with robo-debt and things like this if you adopt a simpler model could actually fundamentally be quite attractive to a political group. I'm not sure.
I think I'm going to struggle to get major party politicians to agree to a platform of dropping New Start, and you'll struggle to convince major party politicians of a platform that requires 70, 80% GST or whatever it costs. So I don't know how to answer the full version, but we both agree that there are things you can do as stepping stones or halfway there, and that allows me, if I may, to segue to the idea that I'll see if I can get any agreement on. It's quite a small one. It just goes to the idea of how you help the working poor, which can be addressed as a separate question. It doesn't have to be a part of UBI. It could just be a question, how do you help the working poor? Australia's answer to that traditionally has been to have a very high minimum wage, I think the second highest in the world. A suggestion then, every year when they increase the minimum wage, the idea that they should, instead of increasing the minimum wage as a gross level, the target should be to increase the after-tax minimum wage and then give politicians the option of whether they achieve that after-tax minimum wage by increasing the gross minimum wage or by adjusting tax transfers to achieve the same outcome, so the worker is in the exact same position, but potentially there could be more jobs created. So that's a small step that, quite frankly, I think major parties should be getting on that idea right now, and I wonder if I can convince my panellists.
I like it.
Are we happy with that? That's a good point to hand over to the audience. First of all, could you just join me and thank our panel? Great job. Thank you. Now, on my timing, we've got 20, 30 minutes or so, and we really do want to open it up. As I said, if you've got a point to make, feel free to make it, but do try to keep it short and sharp. And wherever someone's got a hand raised, there's someone right in the front here, second table in. There are mics, I think, somewhere. No? Oh, I beg your pardon? No, the mic's coming up. Thanks. Actually, I might stand for this. That's just a bit easier.
Interesting that you just finished on this point of creating more jobs, because there's been a lot of discussion on... AIM. There's been, I noticed, quite a lot of discussion on the idea of how to incentivise people who haven't got jobs to get jobs, and more training on writing resumes and things. I think it's been ignoring the point that there aren't that many jobs out there. I mean, I know personally from people who've applied for jobs and turned out to be one of several hundred for one single job. I think that's been glossed over.
You're absolutely right, and this is why recessions are awful. And we are currently in probably the first of the living memory of many people alive in Australia today. And that lack of economic activity is, that's what it creates. It creates low welfare, it creates low opportunities. I'm the mother of 2 young people, and I fear for them at the moment, right? For the next couple of years, it's going to be awful trying to get a job. But that is the core of the argument, is that we need to get the economy going in order to create more jobs. And it's not that the robots are stealing our jobs, or that something else is coming down and stealing our jobs. It's that, we have created a recession essentially on the back of COVID-19, and we now have to dig ourselves out of that somehow. Now, one proposal has been a jobs guarantee, and we have not talked about that yet, but maybe you might be moving in that direction. There are a couple of issues with this. That the idea of a government jobs guarantee is that, you get a guaranteed amount of work every week, every month from the government. It could be something like 20 to 25 hours. In order to allow you time to look for a job, a real job on your own. But that work would be how would the government use you? Now, hopefully not just painting rocks, because that's almost demeaning, right? Then you have a sense of, well, why am I even here? And you have the psychological issues that I spoke of before developing in longer run scenarios. But it's also a problem, even if the government can find a place to soak up that labor in a productive way, it's the problem of the potential that it will then crowd out private industry. And we, generally speaking, don't feel, I think, broadly in society today that we want a much bigger role for government, or really a much lesser role for government in society. So that means that we sort of want the government to be providing some jobs, but not too many jobs and in the right places. And so it's actually a more difficult administrative scenario than is often admitted. Although I do think that the old work for the dole, unfortunately named scheme, was evaluated somewhat recently and came out looking pretty good. So that kind of idea may be able to be shoehorned into something that's politically feasible.
Quickly, I think obviously job creation is important, and that's what we did in the post-economic depression in the 30s in terms of New Deal, and now obviously governments left-leaning are talking about Green New Deals, for example, so that it's not just jobs giving everyone a shovel, but that it's job that helps to address some synergy between environmental, social and economic goals. But also I think the fact we haven't talked so much about that job creation echoes really a public discourse in the sense that we've kind of psychologised unemployment to the extent, largely I think at least, and if you read any of the tabloids, that the problem of unemployment has become the problem of the unemployed, right? And that tends to be where we focus on character and habit. And yes, we need to fix a whole bunch of things in terms of how we get people to fit jobs, but we shouldn't start the discussion by assuming that people don't have intrinsic motivation, that they need to be externally incentivised for all the reasons we've said, that work matters, all the work matters, right? But we have really kind of made it a very individualistic understanding since the late 1970s.
Sorry to do it again, but I think this is another area where economists hear people talking about what economists say and don't recognise it. But maybe some people are doing it, but my reading when I hear the story about incentivising people to get jobs, it's not an attack on their character at all. It's a recognition that humans follow incentives, and if you can set the incentives right, you will adjust their behaviour, not because they're good or bad people. There's no moral value judgment on that at all. They're just humans following incentives. I follow incentives. You follow. Everyone here follows incentives. Unemployed people aren't different in that way. So that's. I don't think it's a character issue there. I don't think there's anything better or worse about their character, and it doesn't need to come into it. It's just an issue of, can we get the incentives right? And if we get the incentives wrong, we might accidentally incentivize bad behavior. Going back to the issue of jobs. Well, you can always improve incentives, I think. But anyway, going back to the original question you asked about jobs, I should apologise. I'm just falling into economic jargon again. When I talk about an elasticity of labour demand, that literally is creating more jobs. That's how you say it in English, right? If you had we need a translator here to translate economics to English. If they did, every time I said elasticity of labour demand, they would translate that into that means more jobs. And it's an uncomfortable thing for a lot of people to talk about, but the reality is a lower minimum wage would lead to more jobs existing. Now, that raises the problem of the working poor, which is why I was on the front foot saying the solution to my mind is just give more money directly to the working poor. Then you can drop the minimum wage, then you have more jobs, then more people could be working.
Thank you very much. More from the floor? In the middle of the room. Thanks.
We heard a little bit about MinCom and the Finnish trial, and Greg mentioned the trial of the card instead of welfare benefits. What's the role of further trials of some of these economic initiatives? Do you think we could do a UBI in Maryborough, for example, or some of the other suggestions that the panel's come up with tonight? Do you think there's an appetite for that?
I mean, Maryborough is a good example because there is an active kind of basic income movement there. They've been trying to make the case because they're obviously not Maryborough, but Hervey Bay and Bundaberg are at least in that trial site with Hinkler in terms of that federal seat. And they've said, look, rather than just run this cashless debit card trial, let's also have a basic income trial. It's an area that's got high youth unemployment. It's affected in terms of tourism. So it would be an interesting case. And I think, yes, there was also a proposal in New South Wales to do one down near Wollongong as a basic income trial. So you could pick some regions. But I think you'd also want them to be, because most of us still live in cities, 60, 70% of us, and that's increasing, that you'd also possibly want more than one trial site, not just in a region, but also in a city setting where most Australians live. The only thing I'd say about trials, though, is that for governments it can be yes but no, right? So they get pressure, as they have in some of those countries, to put a trial on. They've got no intention, like many good pilot programs have been run in this country, to ever keep those programs going. And we heard reasons why they were shut down. So a trial may seem like a win for the movement, but in fact can be a loss. Because, yes, we'll run it, but we're never going to agree to put a basic income in place. But if we get enough of a coalition around the issue, and in a place like Maryborough, you can have a broad-based coalition of small businesses, local council, community groups, obviously the unemployed themselves, then maybe that provides enough movement to bring it into place and to put it in more permanently. Because what you do want is a demonstration. You want to show that, hey, this can happen and the sky didn't fall in, right? And it's okay to point to other countries, but we say, well, that's not Australia. So we probably still will need one, but I think there's risks with trials, politically. Yeah.
Questions? More? Oh, sorry, I'll just over on the far right here. Thanks. Yeah.
Is that on? Oh, there we are. One of the projections that Simon Cowan said was that unemployment could reach a rate of something like 50%. Now, obviously, that's the worst case scenario, but if it were to reach that sort of rate, obviously, trying to claw money back through income tax becomes quite difficult. Do you think a UBI becomes more attractive or less attractive at that point? And if you don't think it's attractive, what would be the alternative as far as the panellists can see?
I would just say I think that right now we're in a very special time. So the COVID-19 induced recession is different, and that's why we've had things like Job Seeker, Job Keeper, particularly the Job Keeper program, which didn't exist in any form previously. So whatever stimulus the government provides at this moment, and for perhaps the next year to year and a half, that's a recessionary, stimulus response. Right? It's Keynesianism at its best. So I don't think that we would then call those kinds of programs universal basic income and expect that the long-run steady-state employment levels are going to be around 50%. I mean, that's just nuts. So I think, in terms of whether there are structural reasons, like the advent of robots taking our jobs or whatever, to expect that maybe the unemployment rate might creep up, it's possible. It's not here yet. And as we did hear on the video recording, throughout history, there has been technological advance, right? And every time it's happened, yes, there's been a fixed cost in the short run of the people who were previously employed in the industry that got shuttered. They have to find new jobs. This is how the community can help. This is how, programs that try to link people with new jobs and new training and networks can really help. But the idea that that's going to create massive unemployment across the industries all at once, that we're going to be unprepared for unless we have the UBI system already in place, I think that's putting the cart before the horse a bit. So in answer, I think stimulus programs now, yes, that's why we did the JobKeeper, Job Seeker. We'll still have a bit of that going forward beyond September and probably for longer than that. But as a steady state, I don't see employment levels at 50%. I think that would be unsustainable and just not commensurate with what the economy is capable of.
I mean, all I would say is, yes, at the point at which it becomes inevitable that the cost of a robot or machine in certain industries replaces the cost of a human, and we're going to need something to give people income, and that's what that decoupling between income and labour is about. And we could do that in the face of a crisis, But we could also prepare for that event, because what's the worst that would happen? You know, we might actually have a more equal society. We'd have people in less poverty. So I don't think that's a bad outcome, even if robots don't take everyone's jobs.
John, do you want to add? No?
No.
Okay. More questions? Right at the back. In red. Thanks. Yep.
Hello, thank you very much for the talk tonight. My question is to Greg about, you said that poverty is a question of the lack of cash, and I used to think that, and now I'm not quite so sure. And my question is your thoughts on the concept of poverty being caused about not a lack of cash coming in, about cash going out as well. And a couple of things sort of with that. What's to say that just with a UBI that the cost of living just doesn't go up, and then it's sort of, everybody's sort of relatively still, you know, in poverty. And the other thing is for people who are given a UBI, if they're not spending that money on things that then, you know, move them further up in the, you know, up the sort of ladder, I guess, you know, things that are detrimental to them as well, and that kind of thing.
Yeah, sure. So the last point about whether it's inflationary is a debate in UBI and obviously in economics. But, you know, technology also makes things cheaper. So there would be some inflation, but it may not be potentially as great. And potentially if you're spending a lot of that money on essential goods and services, then perhaps it's not going to have the inflationary impact. But Gigi and John will say something about that, because I'm then the soft nodding sociologist, not the hard-nosed economist. But I think in terms of the question about poverty, I do think that we know enough from both, you know, drill down income studies in terms of what people do with money. And there's been some great work, you know, in the US on this in terms of household expenditure and income. There's been just the recent survey in terms of what people have done with the extra coronavirus supplement that they got from ACOS to show that by and large, we don't have to be too concerned that people are going to rush out there and buy flat screen TVs. There was some impact in terms of, if you look at the crime data on some of the basic income trials, where people with some of their disposable income, street property crime went down, but some in terms of you know, drug-related crime went up in terms of illicit substances. So that absolutely could be an issue. But again, I do think there's lots of other things that would need to go in place. It's not just about cash, but all I'm saying is that that's the first problem I worry about in terms of poverty, is not the character of the person, but the lack of cash.
The inflation issue hasn't really come up here. I don't think it necessarily needs to. Whether a UBI was to lead to inflation or not would really depend on how you fund it. So if we went the MMT route to just print $400 billion extra every year, yes, that would lead to inflation. But there are ways to do a UBI and fund it differently. So if you did it by, I had a throwaway line before, but that's roughly what the numbers would add up to. If you had an 80% GST, that would fund a fully generous UBI. And that would involve inflation in the year you introduced the 80% GST, but in the years after that, you wouldn't have any more inflation. So there wouldn't be an inflation issue. It would be a, oh my God, we have 80% GST issue. But you don't have to have inflation. It depends how you fund it.
All right. There was someone over here on the left. Sorry.
That's good. It's a question from someone on the left.
Ah, sorry. Yes, indeed. Fellow in the check shirt. Yeah, thanks. And then after that, the bloke next to you.
Yes. Thank you. I wanted to ask from each of you whether you think there are certain types of voices that are missing from this debate. And I was just kind of curious because when I look at the arguments for and against and the popularity of UBI as an idea, it seems kind of surprising that 1 out of 4 speakers are really arguing for strongly. So I was just wondering if you think there are other perspectives that we're kind of not hearing here, or that kind of flesh out the concept kind of beyond the basic economics.
Firstly, 1 out of 4 are arguing for a big UBI. I'd argue for a small UBI. I guess one argument that none of us have touched on, perhaps because none of us strongly believe it, is the Andrew Yang technology will steal our jobs line. So to have a full discussion, maybe we need Andrew Yang here as well. Others?
Yeah, I mean, I think the other voice, so a few weeks ago, I participated in an artist-led economy debate on UBI, and it was, a really good opportunity to hear how that industry, that sector, had, one, been affected by the pandemic, but two, wanted, I guess, some way in which what they do, make a contribution, should be recognised, right? So I think, yes, we had some artists and people in the entertainment industry talking about this, given, how precarious their employment is in particular, but also what value they add to society that doesn't tend to get the same sorts of remuneration that we've just been talking about in relation to lots of other people and the rewards they get from high-paid jobs.
So just as with COVID-19 policy, the people who make the policy are very different from the people who are impacted by the policy most heavily. And so I think, yes, the people who don't have positions on stages like this to, pronounce about things are the ones who would have a sea change in their personal circumstances were UBI to be implemented potentially. And, to be honest, I've not seen like a focus group study or some other qualitative study of, what do people at the bottom of the income distribution think about UBI, but I would wager that they would be more positively inclined than people at the top of the income distribution in general for reasons of simple economic incentives. So it's not that hard to imagine why that would be the case. I also think in the current environment where people are very insecure about their economic security, they're looking for purity. They're looking for something they can believe in. They're looking for magic bullets. They're looking for pure causes. And the universal basic income sounds wonderful. Just listen to it. Universal basic money. Money for everybody. Wow, right? Sounds great. And it's an almost godlike sort of appearance that this has, I think, in some people's conception. And that then generates support, which is not necessarily support that has come from a very reasoned thinking through of all the costs and benefits and the current system and how would this work and where would we implement and is it politically feasible, is it affordable, would it really be best for society as a whole. It comes from, oh my goodness, yes, that sounds great, please give me this so I can feel a bit in control of this very uncertain environment. So that is not an economic argument, that is a religious argument or a religious position. And so, yes, it is possible we haven't captured that position on the stage today.
I'm not quite a zealot for UBI, just to clarify. But, I do think the question of whether it's desirable, it needs to come first before affordable, right? I mean, we've just had a whole $270 billion committed over the next 10 years to national security and our concern about where we are in the region in terms of the Pacific. If we were as concerned about national security as we were about economic security, then we could muster, not that we would fund the UBI trial or UBI to the same extent that we've been talking about in the generous scheme, but it is about priorities. I mean, that's what a budget statement is. It's an expression of values. And I do think we need to recognise that. So I do think, yes, we need to work out the implementation, the affordability, but if we make this an accounting discussion or only an economic discussion, we're not thinking about what is the ends that this would serve. And I think we have to focus on that and then think about the means and not get that order wrong.
I agree with clarifying values and priorities. I don't think it can be considered outside the context of its cost because it's a policy idea. Policy ideas need to be measured on their benefits and costs and only introduced if the benefits exceed the costs. So yes, we need to know what the benefits are, but then we absolutely need to know the costs up front so we can make a proper comparison. So I don't think the issues can be separated very easily.
Thank you very much. Sorry, there was a question down here.
Hi, my question's for John. I like the idea of your negative income tax and going for more efficiency. And you mentioned cutting the minimum wage to create more jobs, which makes sense if you have a basic income so people aren't on the streets. But how do we ensure that the current minimum wage jobs, particularly full-time jobs, those rates don't go down as well, and then you end up just giving, we go through all this effort of raising the taxes to pay for a UBI and then hand it over to the mega corporations, thinking like Walmart handing workers at Walmart being on food stamps. How do we avoid that situation here?
Well, under what I'm suggesting, it couldn't be fully avoided. Some people on the minimum wage, if the minimum wage was dropped, firstly, a lot of people think if you drop the minimum wage, everyone has their income drop. That's not true. But it is true, as I guess you were implying, some people would see their income drop. I guess what I was talking about is the example I gave before, you're on 40, you lose 4, so you're down to 36, but then you get the leftovers of your UBI that hasn't been clawed back yet, so that's another 6, you're up to 42. So the people would be better off, but yes, you're right, some people would see it as a lower wage supplemented with a higher welfare for the working poor, and I think that has costs, but I think the benefit of getting an extra 300,000, 300,000, we've got 900,000 unemployed now. 300,000 new jobs would get unemployment below 4%. I mean, I'm not suggesting that's going to happen soon. Well, no one's going to introduce my policy, but even if they did, it would take a while to happen. But that is not an insignificant set of numbers. So the idea that, yes, unfortunately, some people's wage goes down, but then it gets supplemented, yeah, there's downsides, but 300,000 people being able to get on the ladder, being able to start getting experience, being able to make new networks and greater personal dignity. I think that benefit is worth considering.
We've got time for a couple of questions. Right at the front here, please. Thanks.
I guess I would like to historicize the conversation a bit, and the question put crisply would be this. Given the climatological disaster that we've lived through, then coronavirus, what if there is no normal to go back to? How does that change the way you think about these questions?
So it's a good question, and I think actually that an appreciation of the historical context in which we live is greatly lacking amongst a lot of voters and young people as well, and those are the ones being affected very heavily now, and that may color their positions on all sorts of issues that, away from their own best interests, in fact. But there is, as you say, there is really no actual normal, right? We've seen incredible change, not just the two things that you've just mentioned, but the way in which the methods of work have changed in the last 50 years is incredible, right? And the last 200 years, unfathomable. I mean, ridiculous amounts of change. So the idea that we have sort of a fixed economy and a steady state is essentially an illusion. We are continually inventing new ways, and we will continue to invent new ways of dealing with climate change, dealing with, how do we clean up the pollution that we have now, and we need to provide some government support and incentivize and subsidize efforts towards those kinds of things. And we do have an opportunity to do that now, in fact, with, as Greg was referring to, having investment into green types of industries. If we're going to have a government jobs guarantee, if we can use those people somehow, great, clean up the oceans or whatever it is. But we are an incredibly creative species, and that means that we are always on the move. We're always on the march to the next better way, right, of doing whatever it is. But there are some core things that are fixed. We are a social species. We will always need each other. We will always need networks between each other. We are not going to ever be the Robinson Crusoe who is on his own island making his own economic decisions, which unfortunately is still something taught in many economics textbooks. We have, needs for each other that transcend the economy, but are certainly evident in the economy. And to understand that kind of side of humanity better within the pantheon of what is considered economics, I think would actually benefit policymaking going forward. And this is part of why I argue for more support for network formation, training, integration of people, and empathy of people for one another, because that's what really creates good policy. When we can truly stand in the shoes of somebody else and say, okay, I understand what you're facing. I understand your objectives because you're a human being, just like me, and I understand the constraints because now I see them, having really put myself in your shoes. Now I can see what would benefit you. Okay, now I move to the next person, and the next, and the next, and the next. And ideally, our politicians do this for everybody in the society, and then they do the cost-benefit analysis that John was talking about and say, right, this is the best policy I can come up with. Some are going to be losers, some are going to be winners, but overall, on net, this pushes welfare forward. And that will be a new system. And then 10 years later, people are facing different situations, you have another system. So it's never a fixed system. And I wouldn't get too hung up on one particular idea being, the key, flavor of the month thing that we have to focus everything on. That's what we did with COVID-19, and we're paying the price right now. So we need to keep the eye on the prize historically and remember who we actually are as a species and what we always need.
Yeah, I would just say that, Judith Brett's essay on the resource curse for Australia in terms of the way in which we relied on that and haven't thought it and invested that money is a really telling, wonderful kind of economic history around why we've got in the situation that we are in, that we don't have sovereign wealth funds in the same way that Norway does or that Alaska does in terms of what they put away with the oil resources. So we were smarter about some of those decisions going forward. We should learn those economic lessons. But I think in terms of prosperity, which is part of what we're talking about in terms of what makes a society worth living in, I mean, the ecological argument is that, we have to live within those ecological limits of a finite planet, right? And so I think that we're talking here about sustainable prosperity. What are the sorts of policies that enable that transition? And obviously the whole just transition debate is a really important part of that. So we must put that optic, I think, on any of these economic social policies, is how does it land us in terms of a non-zero carbon future, right? And that's why the renewables make sense in terms of the building back greener story, I think. But also just to say there was nothing, like Gigi said, I mean, normal wasn't healthy, right? I mean, what a pandemic does, which is what Walid Ali says, I think, really eloquently, is that it doesn't change us, it reveals us, all the cracks, all the fissures. And so if we're going to build back, then we can't just paper over those. We need to think about what is the social contract for the 21st century that takes the ecological imperative absolutely seriously and at the heart of that, not consider those things as externalities. Yeah.
All right. Oh, John.
I was going to say it's a really good question in terms of, because my discussion of a UBI is not in the middle of a panic, but if and when things went closer to what we consider normal, what makes sense. So it's a really good question. I don't know yet. I mean, the 2020 is one hell of a drug. I don't think I've internalized how it's changed the arguments yet. So I think this is a good time for a healthy amount of modesty. I know if you just scroll through Facebook, everyone seems to have all the answers already. I think this is a good moment to pause and say, maybe we haven't interpreted this moment yet. It's still going on. And so I don't know.
Right. I apologise for everyone else we're going to miss, but one last question, please. Oh, sorry. Upstairs. Sorry, I couldn't see you up there.
I think some of the conversations that have been missed here tonight are the failure of trickle-down economics, the failure to understand that the present economic system completely misses huge sectors of the economy, such as the carers, who are primarily women, and other sectors like ecological services, so that which are completely, and these sectors are completely devalued in this society. And the practical result of this is that what we have now is, with the pandemic, is we don't have, this isn't, by the way, a supply problem, this is a demand problem primarily, right? And what we're seeing now in terms of the response, you've got hundreds of millions of people around the world who've lost their incomes and now are losing their savings, as well as you've got tens of millions of businesses that are being bankrupted. And what we're seeing now, at the same time as this is taking place, the stock markets are, in often cases, at highs, at record highs, because we're using, again, governments are using the GFC approach, which is top-down approach, which is you pump quantitative easing and so on, you pump money into the top, into the financial sector, which has very little relevance to the people at the bottom and the people who need the money, right? And what we're seeing then, so a lot of economists, a lot of reputable groups like McKinsey Institute and so on like that are saying that this isn't a recession, we're heading into 10-year depression here that we're looking at, because you're going to see entire sectors knocked out. You're going to see hundreds of millions of people that are bankrupted and businesses that are bankrupted who are not going to be able to recover, especially if they start cutting off support payments. But a lot of people are not getting the support payments. It's missing whole groups of people, especially in developing countries. There are many people that are going to be, they're saying up to 250 million people may be facing acute hunger this year, right? There's entire sectors that are being missed out by first of all, they're always missed out in the global economic paradigm, but they're hit particularly hard in this one, right? And so,
excuse me, do you have a question for the panel?
Well, I'm just going to try to sum this up by saying that we have a problem here of growing inequality, bigger and bigger gap between the money going to the top and the bottom because we're lowering tax on the top, et cetera. And we've got a problem of increasing debt loads on both private and public, which is going to lead to probably even sovereign debt failures and chains of defaults taking place, and you've got decreasing productivity, of growth of productivity growth taking place. And all of these problems are getting worse. And you add to this then the systemic underlying crises like global change and so on, the arms race, all these underlying issues that are taking place. And we're looking at a decade of crises taking place. And I think that underlying this, I'm going to ask this question to you, unless we deal with the problem of growing inequality, I don't see any way out of a global depression. So I'd like to throw that to you. Do you think this problem needs to be addressed to prevent a global growing inequality in order to prevent a global depression? And that, of course, fits into this whole question of do we need to start actually supporting the people at the bottom?
We absolutely need to start supporting people at the bottom by opening our economies as soon as we possibly can and living with COVID-19 and accepting that it is not the ridiculous health crisis that it has been made out to be in the media, because you're absolutely right that the people suffering the most from our economic policies here in Australia and across the developed world and in the developing world are the people who have the least. We've gone back, we've regressed 10 years easily, in some cases 20 to 30 years in terms of our progress against poverty in the developing world because of our policies about this health issue, which I will not call a health crisis. In comparison to health crises, real health crises like HIV/AIDS, which took 30 to 40 million people around the world, we've lost not even 1 million. And that's just in terms of body counts. In terms of everything else, there's so much I could say. But you're absolutely right that we have a huge humanitarian catastrophe on our hands right now, and it's because of the policies we've implemented. So yes, that is a big problem.
I'm not even going to debate that because we need a whole other night about the economic costs of whether you go for suppression or open up the economy, right? Because people will also suffer if you open the economy up. It's not just deaths, it's hospitalisations, it's people impaired, not being able to get back to work, right? So there's lots we could talk about there that's not as simple as a death count, and I think that's a very utilitarian way of looking at it. But in terms of inequality, I think if you address the issue of inequality and you have less equals, so, US is a good example. It's more unequal now than ancient Rome, right, in terms of income and wealth inequality. And that just has a corrosive effect on society. This is the Wilkinson and Pickett, the public health economist argument, is that more equal societies are healthier and happier. They have stronger pro-environmental values. They're going to support a carbon tax. So inequality is absolutely corrosive, and it's never just about growing the pie. It's about how do we slice that pie, right? And that's the problem, I think, in terms of the jobs and growth argument. That's what's got us into the ecological problem.
I'm not quite sure how to start. I think I basically disagree with everything said in the question, but there was too much for me to be able to go through point by point. There's so many issues here to do a deep dive. We could do another whole day on COVID, another whole day on inequality itself. Then I'll just make two notes. Firstly, I agree that how long this crisis lasts is in large degree how long we keep the economy locked up. I don't know how long we'll keep the economy locked up, so I don't know how long the worst of the crisis lasts. That's, again, humility there. We haven't had tax cuts for the top. I mean, we had bracket creep given back after 3 years, but after 3 years, the tax rates at the top are higher than they've ever been. So that's just a talking point that's used to try and push an agenda. There's no such thing as trickle-down economics. It's just a made-up concept used as a slur against people that believe in the price mechanism. So I don't know how to respond to that because it's not a real thing.
I just want to respond on the tax cuts issue, right? Last time Howard government gave out $74 billion of tax cuts, 40% of those went to the top income earners. What they proposed this week is the worst thing you would do in a pandemic in bringing forward those tax cuts from 24, 25 to now. Because again, most of those tax cuts are going to high income earners. That's not the people you want to be putting money in the pockets of.
That's bracket creep for a couple of years.
Gee, we were so close to agreement. Never mind. I'm going to get a quick plug in here. I don't know how many of you read in Queensland. It's a new online newspaper that comes out every day at noon if you sign up. And there's a column in there today which talks about a new, really awful phrase that's been around in corporate speak for a while called the burning platform, which actually referred to a terrible incident in 1988, I think, when 166 people died except for one fellow who decided to jump 30 metres into the cold water and survived. People like Ken Henry are now using this phrase to describe what's going on at the moment, and various people trying to push big tax changes and big other ideas. So some of the ideas you heard here tonight, you might say, gee, that's sort of out of left field, it may not, or right field, and it may not ever come good. But right at the moment,
I think the policy makers are actually getting desperate. So if you've got some good ideas out of tonight's talk and you want to work out how to get someone to hear about it, I think the policy makers are actually getting desperate. So I think tonight's talk has been really valuable. I'd like to thank our speakers, I'm sure you do too, for all of the wonderful contribution. And now, to round things off, thank you.
Wow. Thank you, Bob, and thank you, speakers. That was really an entertaining and enlightening, and I know I've learned so much tonight. And personally, I'm all for talking to Gina about her taxes. Let's do that. Now I'd like to call the Governor of the Brisbane Dialogues, Murray Hancock, to give his vote of thanks.
Well, there might be a small risk of overthanking the speakers, but I don't think we should worry about that. I'd also like to use the artistic licence that comes with being in the Tivoli and adding to the vote of thanks to the speakers, repeating the thanks to the Tivoli and the owners particularly, and to all our volunteers. We've all done a great job in the middle of very busy lives, in some cases quite crazy busy lives. It's been extraordinary. The first speaker I would like to thank is Gigi Foster. I'll go in strict alphabetical order on first name, so it doesn't look like it's just ladies first. Gigi's enthusiasm about and commitment to actually getting here is the main reason we did stick to Plan A and have a real live event. She said from the start she'd drive up if necessary. So Plan B wasn't a video conference, it was a border crossing on a farm owned by a Brisbane Dialogues supporter. Just joking, of course, but I won't name the supporter who's real, and the border crossing is real, but he may not want it broadcast. Bookending Gigi's commitment was Greg Marston's. The origin of tonight's event really was in a church hall in West End late last year, where Greg had arranged for one of the godfathers of the global basic income movement to speak, the UK economist Guy Standing. Chatting afterwards, we touched on the possibility of collaborating on a side event at the Global Basic Income Conference that was to have been held in Brisbane this year. Fast forward, and Greg stepped right up and into the shoes of our Melbourne speaker, who all of a sudden felt very unwelcome in Queensland. We were honoured to have the Australian representative and one of the leaders of the global movement to speak, and I'm sure you'll agree he did a pretty good job as a stand-in. I met John briefly at an event about a year ago, thinking he seemed like quite an interesting fellow. It was only a couple of months ago, researching for speakers, that I discovered that UBI was one of his many interests and that he indeed had some interesting views. So while not alone among the speakers on this, John personifies a refreshing tendency to think outside conventional political boxes. Simon Cowan did everything he possibly could to contribute despite being grounded, and he's put a lot of work into UBI, as you can see, over some years, and I think the discussion still benefited from his participation remotely. And finally, to our moderator, Bob MacDonald, keeping to alphabetical order. Over a coffee in December, Bob spontaneously offered to help as a moderator or facilitator and has brought decades of relevant experience to bear tonight. His contribution not only started early, but has taken up a lot of his time over the past month or so. Skilled moderators are probably the most essential ingredient in succeeding what Brisbane Dialogues is trying to do, and we should be enormously grateful to Bob for setting a fine example. We do have tokens of gratitude for the speakers, but we're going to keep things moving and do them differently. So let's make up for that by not doing it on the stage. So let's make up for that by showing our appreciation of their contributions to this outstanding discussion in the generous traditional manner.
So that concludes tonight's big dialogue. Thank you for attending and helping us to encourage better public discussions of big ideas and issues in our region. A recording will be available soon, and we will do an email broadcast when it is ready, but we aren't allowed to use some of your email addresses. So if you want to receive a code to view it as part of your ticket tonight, please email the brisbanedialogues@gmail.com or use the contact form at brisbanedialogues.org/contact. Make sure you are subscribed for updates on future events, check the flyer for ways to get involved and support the cause. There is a contactless donation station just behind the camera there. Money donated will help us support more dialogues with partnered organisations. We are planning a simpler, smaller, less expensive, regular monthly Monday events starting next month. The first one will be by invitation only to active supporters on the internal topic, where to the Brisbane Dialogues. If you want to be invited to this event, please express your interest to the brisbanedialogues@gmail.com or use the contact form brisbanedialogues.org/contact. So finally, I would like to invite the premium ticket holders to make their way to the lower bar to meet the speakers if they wish, and invite everyone to carry on the discussion over a drink and a snack from one bar or another. Enjoy.